Hey, what's up guys? Welcome to DIY Film Malaysia. Today we're talking about DSLR cameras. So, you want to be a filmmaker, eh? Well, no problem. Today I'm going to teach you some of the basic settings you're going to need to know if you want to be a DSLR filmmaker. And it's going to be resolution, frame rate, and triangle exposure. So if you're shooting a video on a DSLR camera, you're going to have the option to shoot it in HD, in Full HD, and several other resolutions. Generally, most people use HD and Full HD, which is pretty much the same thing. The only difference between HD and Full HD is just that HD has less calories. Actually, it's the pixel resolution, yeah. Full HD is 1920 by 1080 and HD is 1280 by 720. Now, depending on the kind of resolution that you use, it could actually affect your frame rate. Some cameras might not support particular kinds of frame rates at a particular kind of resolution, which of course brings us to our next point, which is frame rate. What is the correct frame rate for you to use if you're shooting film on a DSLR camera? So if you wanted to have the film look, the correct frames per second that you need to use is 24 frames per second. So why 24, you might ask? Why not 72? Why not 105? Well, the reason for that is way back in the day when they shot things on actual film, people shot it using 24 frames per second. And we're just used to that motion blur. Anything faster seems a little too smooth. Anything that's not 24 frames per second basically won't have that film motion blur. So you want to have the film look, it's 24 frames per second. Sometimes you might have seen other frame rates such as 30 frames per second or 29.97. Now these are generally used for TV, and in case you're wondering, why do we have such a weird frame rate, 29.97? Why do we have that 97? It's just so strange. Just make it 30, right? It's got something to do with when televisions back in the day, when they were moving over from black and white to color, that's when, for mathematical reasons, they had to adjust it to 29.97. There's a very interesting video about it here, which you can check out in case you're a little bit of a film nerd. You've always been wondering, why 29.97? So frame rate also affects the speed of your video. If you're planning on shooting something which is slow motion and you want to get all the detail of the shot, what you need to do is you need to double your frame rate to make it twice as slow or half as fast. Either way. Just remember, okay, more frames means that you'll have more information to slow it down later on in post. Last but not least, we're talking about triangle exposure. So what is triangle exposure? It's basically the triangle of your ISO, your shutter speed, as well as your aperture. These three things will affect how exposed your footage is. So if you've ever seen a DSLR camera, you might have noticed that the lenses are interchangeable. Each lens will have its own f-stop. The lower the f-stop basically means that more light is allowed to come into the camera. The higher the f-stop means less light is coming into the camera. The aperture or the f-stop of your camera will also affect the depth of field of your shot. So a lower f-stop means a shallower depth of field, a higher f-stop means a wider depth of field. What is depth of field, you might be asking? Well, I'm glad you asked that, imaginary person, whoever you are. Okay, so depth of field is basically the distance between the closest and furthest object from the camera that stay in focus. A shallow depth of field means that objects that are closer to the camera or further away from the camera appear blurred out. Whereas a wider depth of field means that everything appears to be in focus. Now, there's certain positive things to having a shallower depth of field, like for example, if you're shooting a subject and maybe you don't want people to pay attention to his background, there could be people walking around or there could be something distracting at the back. You want to have a shallow depth of field so that only your subject is in focus and everything else is out of focus. Next up is shutter speed. What's the correct shutter speed to use? Okay, well, shutter speed is going to affect the motion blur of your shot. It's not just for exposure. And the correct shutter speed for you to use is double whatever your frame rate is. So what is your frames per second? If you choose 24, double that will be 48. Now, you usually don't have 48 as an option on the camera, so you'll choose 50. If you're shooting at 30 frames per second or 29.97, times 2, you will get 60. That is the correct shutter speed for you to use. Now, if you do not choose the correct shutter speed, Images that are moving could appear stuttering, they could appear not quite as smooth, and you're not going to get the correct motion blur for your film. So it's very important for you to choose the correct shutter speed to match your frame rate. Last but not least, ISO. What is ISO? It's basically digitally you can control how sensitive your camera is to light. So for example, a lower ISO means that your camera is not very sensitive to light. A higher ISO means that your camera is more sensitive to light. Now, there are downsides to raising your ISO too high. If it goes too high, your footage could appear grainy with a lot of noise. So that's something that you're going to have to control. So between the ISO, the shutter speed, and the aperture, you will be able to control how exposed your shot is. If it's overexposed, for example, you can bring the ISO all the way down. You can then make certain adjustments to the aperture and possibly last the shutter speed, but it's really up to you. Maybe if you don't have a lot of movement, you want to adjust the shutter speed. That is going to be your call. But between the ISO, the shutter speed, and the aperture, you're going to have to adjust these three things to get the correct exposure for your masterpiece. Anyway, this is it for DIY Film Malaysia. If you haven't liked the video, please hit like. If you haven't subscribed, please subscribe. And until next time, I'll see you guys again on the flip side. Ciao.